Good evening and welcome. I am Liv Corman with the Newberry. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's program, Chicago Punk, Photography, Art, and Design. Our appreciation also goes to the Art Design Chicago for its generous support of this event. Let me ask everyone to please silence your phones at this time. Our mission at the Newberry is to connect you with our extensive collection and the humanities. To do this, we organize free public programs, adult education courses, and free exhibitions. If you would like to explore our collection further, getting a free reader's card at our Welcome Center is quick and easy. Our staff are happy to answer your questions about the Newberry after the program, or you can visit our website to explore all we have to offer. Our exhibition galleries will be open after this program, so please feel free to stop by. The current exhibition is Indigenous Chicago. Programs like this one are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. To support our work, consider making a gift to the Newberry. And a little plug for tonight, please get a poster signed by these three artists after the program tonight. And also, please check out our bookstore for books from Sonnenzimmer and Dan Sinker's book. We'll end this event with a Q&A. Whether you're in the room or on Zoom, please text your questions to 833-899-3399 at any time during the conversation. The phone number will be on the screen throughout. It's also on your programs, and we'll have it posted in the Zoom. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Nadine Nakanishi came to Chicago from Switzerland in 2003 for an internship at Punk Planet Zine. The experience of meeting working artists of the city gave her the courage to pursue art and envision what centering a creative life might look like. Highlights of her path include experiencing how artist relationships are generative conversations, radical connections in time, singular and concentrated, and defined by velocious dynamics that have no boundaries. Since 2006, she has pursued a collaborative and experimental practice with Nick Butcher, also known as Sonnenzimmer. Dan Sinker is a journalist, multimedia artist, designer, and maker, and founder of the iconic Punk Planet Zine, for 13 years, the definitive voice of the national indie music and art scenes of the 90s and 2000s. He is also known for co-hosting popular podcasts including Says Who and The Hitch, and his fictionalized Rahm Emanuel Twitter account, which was later released as the book, The Effing Epic Twitter Quest of @Mayor Emanuel. Martin Sorrondeguy is the singer of American hardcore punk bands Los Crudos and Limp Wrist, and founder of the DIY record label Lengua Armada Discos. Since the early 2000s, Sorrondeguy has been very active in solo and group photo exhibitions of his photography, which has also been documented in his semi-regular zine, Susto. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Yep, thank you.
Did you guys hit your buttons?
Yeah, my button's on.
All right.
Yeah.
It's hard to hear if we've hit our buttons.
All right, we're going to get started. So I'm going to have to do this.
I know.
How is art and photography and design a part of punk? So we put together a few slides getting into punk logos. And as a young person, when I started really exploring underground music, a logo was everything. If you were a band and didn't have a logo, it was like you didn't exist. And logos to this day are code for us. So when we're on the train, on the bus, or walking down the street, I'll be like, what's that kid wearing? You know, and then I see like the bands that they're wearing. And I think especially in the 80s and 90s and onwards, it was really important to find your people who liked music the way you did, you know? So this is basically, you know, Dan was like, I couldn't figure them all out.
It was the blue circle.
The blue circle is like the germs. Are you kidding? So I put this together just to kind of give an example of just a few of some popular logos. I had to throw in Naked Reagan, of course, and Crudos, but yeah.
There was a thing when we had a bunch of chats before this talk, and it was like, when you were like, well, yeah, of course, design, everyone needed to have a logo. It was like, oh, I never thought of that. Like, but it's true. There's such a level of like, in the beginning, there was the logo to all of this because yeah, you needed it.
Yes. Okay, and then I, talked about or thought about flyers, and I'm a huge collector of flyers and fanzines and everything. So I wanted to kind of highlight some, classic flyers, classic bands, Avengers, X, Cramps, Castration Squad, Loot, so on and so forth. So this was, the sort of underground news for the longest of time. Now with the internet, people just post. Back in the day, you saw it on a poll. Somebody gave it to you at a show, and that was sort of how we received information about what was happening. I remember in the very early days for me, I would walk around trying to find whatever I could. But the coolest thing is when you found other punks, you're like, you into punk? So am I. What's happening? What shows are going on? If you went to a town that wasn't yours, that's how you kind of figured things out.
There was so much about the look and everything that was code, right? Like it was, these would literally just be on light posts. Like I remember in high school being in bands and you'd just go with tape or with wheat paste and you'd put them up and, you would be leaving these little, it's almost like little like,
Clues.
yeah, like little clues around. And
It was
same
punk
with
Pokemon.
yeah, it was totally punk Pokemon. But yeah, with logos on jackets or on shoes, right? Like you would draw your favorite band's logos on your shoes and flyers up on posts and you were following clues, right? Like you were totally following like a gingerbread trail.
Yeah. And I just think the beauty of the flyer, some of them are really horrendous, but I collect those too because they're just so bad. But I also love some that are really stylized and clearly they had a perspective and an aesthetic. So here's some other legendary ones. I mean, if I think of Crime, for instance, from San Francisco, they had a look. And when you saw Crime stuff, you're like, it was slick. There was a lot of photo and art, and then their logo was really cool. And of course, Raymond Pettibone and the Black Flag, relationship and the, constant use of his early work. And of course, anybody who's explored underground music, this skull when you see it. It's overused all the time. The Misfits, it. So I'm always drawn to these artifacts or pieces of paper. And here's a few more that came up later. Yeah, Born Against. This was a really great 90s band, and the rebel sound of shit and failure, yes. Yeah. And a few more I had to throw in there: the Bad Brains, Germs, Maximum Rock and Roll, huge, a very important fanzine for the longest of time. And I forgot what I did. Oh, the Go-Go's, really early Go-Go's flyer, yeah. And then
the other thing to remember with this stuff is you're also talking about a moment where Xerox machines were plentiful, right, and easy to get access to, so that making flyers, right, like 10, 20 years ahead of that, like it's like, oh, you go to the printer, I guess, and you would ask them to print you some, like that wasn't, but like Xerox flyers was such a reflection of a moment in time, right?
And you always knew the person who was just going to take forever standing in front of the copier at whatever, back in the day, Kinko's, and you're just like, oh, it's one of those creative moments. And you knew you couldn't just copy your, yard sale sign or something. But I always loved that moment where you could walk into a studio moment at a corporate place and just witness the creation happening there from a lay perspective or an art perspective, but it was happening right aside a commercial checkout at the same. It was unbelievable, and they just let you sometimes be there for hours, like a library or so. Like,
oh, totally.
I don't know how that was possible, but I feel like a lot of them happened in this like twilight zone of a clerk just looking the other way, maybe because he was also into the music,
Well, like the 24-hour copy shop, right? Like that was a thing that existed. There was one on I forget what street, but it was just near Wicker Park. And I remember like you would go at night late, and I'd be working on a flyer, some weird Xerox art thing, and then suddenly you'd look over and there was like Wesley Willis wrestling with a computer. And I remember I met the guy that did that zine Speed Kills at the time, which was a really beautifully designed like kind of car culture zine. But he was the first one I've ever met that had like a little like slide rule, and he would like compute how much he needed to like increase or decrease the size of things before it was. But they were just like, you would show up at a copy shop at 2 a.m. in Chicago, and it was like everyone else was doing the same thing as you, and the people that worked there did not care, right? Like they were just like, yeah, whatever, man, it's cool.
So can I ask, I'm just going to break the format a little
Yeah.
bit because I have these two amazing people here that I can ask this question now. But so we're kind of looking at the same thing, the patina of the streets, or photocop or whatever. You ran a label, you ran a magazine. How did this kind of layout inform what was going to go on your EP, what was going to go onto the cover? Like, how did this aesthetic inform your choices in what you were doing?
I think there was something that, for me, there's some of this early work that was so crude, and I don't want to say slapped together, but sometimes some of these were made really quickly, and the recognizing that it wasn't impossible to do it, that you can actually repeat this sort of process was extremely attractive to me. And when I went to start making my own flyers, I know I was, already getting all this information, and there were things that were speaking to me that I was like, okay, I'm going to do this too. And I think, my first flyers were probably really horrible, but whose isn't, And it just got better and better with time. So it was a really nice practice and a really nice way to kind of, just become more and more familiar with the whole process. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the first thing is there was just a level of accessibility, right? Like if you could see cut lines, right, then how this thing was cut together, right? And I'll talk about this a little more when we talk about Punk Planet. But there was a point where I think this look becomes more retro, right? Where you're trying to capture an aesthetic that is of the past versus simply using tools of the present, right? So there was a point with Punk Planet where we began to kind of move away from this look, and then eventually find sort of a midpoint between, all the way to digital to all the way to hand, and sorted that out.
Okay, so then I wanted to create a little section about the real news, which was the punk news. This is how we learned about bands. This is like we learned about what was happening in different cities, who was doing stuff, where it was happening. And, I had to give a nod to some of the early zines, Flipside being a really big one for the Los Angeles scene in particular. And I wanted to bring this in. They even have the 1979 calendar. I was always just shocked and just taken aback by, like, the smallest thing, this new band that just got started, 2 weeks ago, all of a sudden is in a fanzine. It's like, who are you? And that's how we figured it out. We're like, all right, I need to check this out. I heard about this band. I know nothing about them. I'm curious enough. Where is their demo? And that's a whole other level of hunting. And I'm not going to get that into that, but yeah. So I brought in, of course, that, and then I brought in these other zines that are in my archive that I love. Old No from New York, Fanzine, great zine, really focusing on fempunk. If This Goes On by Sharon Cheslow, DC, and Colin Sears, and a Positive Force DC fanzine called Off Center. But these are some of the pieces that I just was like, these are great fanzines. They were really resourceful. Prior to the internet too, I was reading articles in Maximum Rock and Roll in the 80s about feminism and about wars happening in different countries, like things that you weren't hearing on the news, things that you were going, all right, I'm getting this whole different perspective. And it was all coming from almost always a very left-leaning sort of viewpoint on what is happening. But I learned so much about, there was a whole tour called Rock Against Reagan, and there were all these things that were happening. Positive Force in the DC scene were protesting and doing percussion protests. And you were just learning so much because that wasn't ever going to get covered anywhere,
Well,
so.
and fanzines, I think, to some degree, kind of crystallized that sort of gingerbread trail thing, right? Where, like, if you were in the lived environment, you were kind of looking at polls or looking at logos and that sort of thing. But fanzines collected it all in one place, right? And so you could, it presented a culture in a way that that was really unique, and it was aesthetic, right? But it also had, who was playing, and it's impossible at this point to imagine pre-internet, right? But you're talking about little tiny bands, like little bands that do not exist outside of the town that they're playing in usually, or a record label that might be putting out 100 LPs or 7-inches or whatever. And suddenly there was a mechanism with which to let people outside of the tiny little scene that you knew know about this thing, right? Like, that's insane. And the network that they largely traveled in were with bands as they drove around, right? And so bands would usually have the little bit of merch, the t-shirts or the 7-inches or whatever that they were selling, but they would have a bunch of zines that they would be bringing along as well. And so there was this amazing kind of built network that was, and you would drop zines at record stores if you were going through a town. It was a really incredible, completely DIY method of getting things out.
And sometimes I did a zine with my friends, and sometimes people didn't care. It was a quarter, and they didn't want it. And you're like, oh, wow, this is a quarter, And it's like people are walking away from us, like, so disinterested. And that's just the reality of it. It's like, who are we? They don't care, So you just kind of would get frustrated. You're like, we put so much heart into this zine, and okay, it's terrible now that I look back at it, but it was made with love.
Nadine, I'm curious, because at the time you were in Switzerland, right?
Yeah, and I was smuggling kind of zines wherever I could drop them, like putting them into random coffee shop places, leaving them in trains. And then my friend Alexandra Wenger, she's in Australia now, and maybe she's tuning in, but she ran a small zine called Don't Laugh, Real Rocker. And
Yes.
She let me do kind of a turducken. I got to put a pamphlet into her zine that she was distributing. So we buddied up, and I was able to slip in folded, 8.5 by 11 ish into her magazine. But I think you're right. It was an effective, real-time way to create velocity for this content. And I'm not just talking about like music, but the whole visual culture as a carrier, if that was like an EP or a flyer or a fanzine. And there was this also very open curiosity. It's like, you're going to read all the junk and you're going to look at all the junk. There was this for me, it was like, I will look at anything that's out there, even if I don't visually like it, because where else would I get the exposure to it?
Totally.
Here's a few more I brought in. Of course, I had to bring Naked Raygun somewhere in this, but it's in Maximum Rock and Roll. Just a few other zines. Slug and Lettuce was great, by Christine Bortz, photographer out of the East Coast. All right, photography. Let's talk about another element of visuals in punk. So I brought in some sort of classic images by photographers who their works made massive impacts on punk, because to hear the music is one thing, to see images of it kind of would hit you in this different way. So of course, Ruby Ray out of San Francisco. I wanted to highlight Murray Bowles, who passed away a few years ago, and there's a book about to come out any day now of his work from the Bay Area. Alison Braun, she's out of LA. She used to go by the name Mouse in Maxim Rock and Roll and Flipside. Jim Jacoy did this wonderful color Polaroids book of just people posing at different clubs and things like that. Here's Christine Bortz, and of course, legendary Edward Culver, the famous Boots photo that you'll see on like Bad Religion stuff or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think it was when well, I'll get into my stuff later, but yeah, I mean, this is the sort of stuff that when you read about it, you hear it, and then you see these pictures, you're just like, what is this? Like, especially when you're really young and you see these things early on, it's massive. It makes you go, what is happening in the world and why am I not there, right? So that's kind of, I had to bring these in. I brought a few more others. I just love, because some of the photography ended up on record. So that's where you were seeing a lot of this outside of the fanzines. It could be on a record cover. Ann Suma's image of the bags at the Hong Kong Cafe in Los Angeles, classic Lenny Friedman minor threat photo, and Bill Daniel. This became a huge ad. This was posters all over cities across America. I don't know if you remember it. It was just a few years ago. I think it was a Vans ad. Yeah, because he's got Vans on. So it became this massive, I was like, how can I steal one of these billboards? I was like, I want one. But, that's my obsession with collecting stuff. But let's keep going. Okay, the Chicago of it all. Did you want to?
Sure. So, part of the focus of this is Chicago. And how did Chicago kind of factor into the stuff that you were doing, right? Besides the obvious, right? Me and you lived there. Nadine, you came a little bit later, but I'm just curious about, like, as you look at your work, how Chicago influenced it, right? Or where you were drawing from within this place.
I want to hear from Martin. You're the triple mega. You studied photography. You ran a label. You were a performer. You wrote music. You toured.
Yeah. It's tough to say like how the Chicago of it all. I mean, just growing up on the southwest side of the city, I think you're kind of a special breed on the south side of Chicagoan, and I was, there were things I was exposed to, but I wanted so much more as I was getting older. I was in high school. I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, and I was like, I need art earn out. Like, that was really, I remember I took the only art class that existed in my high school, and it was run by a priest, and he just wanted us to like draw trees. And I'm like, trees are great, but I don't want trees. Like, I don't want trees. I wanted much more than trees. And, I was really at odds with a lot of people at the school. I just didn't fit. And I struggled with that. And it wasn't until I got to Columbia College and I went, boom, this is the world I want to be in. I was meeting all these amazing artists. I would spend hours in the archive, the old, like the photo books that were like, editions of 20. You had to give like your life over at the librarian to see these books. And I would just sit there for hours looking at these works. So I was really like a sponge. So when, I finally left not even when I left high school, because I was in high school, I would go see the Circle Jerks and then go to class the next day. And, my parents would be mad at me because they're like, you went out 3 times this week. But I'm like, I need it. I need to see as much as I could possibly see. But, I just think, you know, my first real sort of underground show was a Naked Raygun show, and that was it. I was like, I was overwhelmed with what I was seeing. You know, growing up in Pilsen, you know, there weren't a lot of punk rockers, but when we found each other, like whether you were like in Little Village or Back of the Yards or wherever, it was like, you and I see you, and we are into something, you know. And there was something really powerful about that. But seeing that Naked Raygun show for the first time,
Where was that at?
it was at the Cabaret Metro.
Okay.
And I can't describe it, but the whole place just moved. And it was, always say it was raining bodies as the band played. Because it was like, you know, 3 girls with mohawks armed locked, like stage diving. It was just crazy. It was really awesome. And, you know, coming up from where I was coming from, I was just like, you know, this is cool, you know. So yeah, and then, you know, there's so much I could say about Chicago and growing up in it, like, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, again, like pre-internet, but also like the Metro was certainly a center point, right?
Mhm.
But you had to be a band of a certain size to play the Metro.
Yeah.
And so Chicago had this really broken up scene in a lot of ways. Like I grew up in Evanston, and there was sort of like the whole North Shore punk scene, right? And then it was like, oh, I've heard there's like a South Side punk scene. And like, it wasn't until the Fireside Bowl opened up that I was like, whoa, there was like a whole scene in Downers Grove? Who knew, right? Like, you just didn't know. Like it was very hard to know kind of what was happening across the city. I was actually just talking to someone the other day who's like doing a PhD thesis on Chicago punk, and it was like, man, when the Fireside Bowl opened up, that was such an interesting thing because it was, for those of you that don't know, the Fireside Bowl, which is still on Fullerton, I think is now a bowling alley again. For a long time, it was just sort of a moldering, rotting bowling alley that people started booking punk shows at, and it continued to be a moldering, rotting bowling alley that then held punk shows probably, 6-7 days a week?
Yeah.
I mean, just an unbelievable amount, which was totally different than what the city had before.
Yeah.
So it really transformed a lot of what had been very scattered scenes to suddenly having sort of a central place that people were able to kind of go and meet and interconnect, and that it was, you know, pretty easily accessible via transportation, right? It was on Fullerton and Western, so it was easy to come up from the south. It was easy to come down from the north. It was, you know, it was really transformative in a lot of ways.
I just have to add, because my brain is going through my timeline,
Yeah.
and it's like, with Crudos in particular, there was an era of the scene that pulled out of the clubs, and that was the most amazing thing that could have ever happened to punk, is when it pulled out of the sort of template of the regular rock and roll stuff. And we played Laundromat in Little Village. We played church basements in Pilsen. We played on the street. We would play anywhere imaginable. A friend would be like, our first show was in his basement on Coulter, and he called it the 6 feet under because it was his basement. And we played, Crudo's first show was at his house. And just like, you know, we wanted that. We wanted, like, where is it? The most non-traditional place you can do a punk show? That is our punk. And that was like
Basements,
amazing.
VFW halls, right? Like up on the north side, it was Roy Burgess's parents' house basement, which Crudos and my high school band played together. Mm-hmm. And I remember Roy's dad came down and was really pissed.
Yelling, yeah.
Well, to be fair, now that I'm a dad, right? Like I'm like, oh yeah, there were people like kicking down the like drop ceiling from the basement. Like I would probably be kind of pissed too, actually.
I really like that you bring this out, breaking out of the format, because that's kind of like when I came in the early 2000s as someone who had no connection to Chicago, but really was looking at from an outside perspective in. So it's like really amazing for me to say like Los Crudos was in my life in Switzerland, in rich Switzerland, privileged Switzerland, but I got to know them through like a Slovenian punk band who just was like, listen to this. And so when I came to the city, the way I had to kind of knuckle the knowledge together was just, you know, and also pre-internet-ish I mean, the internet was out there, but, dial-up was still a thing, It was these raw spaces that were ironically very safe to go alone. I found it weirdly that I could just go into these spaces and feel safer than in these big spaces. And I bring this up because I think this kind of experimental, very intimate domestic space, when we look at the photography, this is a scene seeing themselves. Like, when Spike Lee takes the camera fisheye down here and films skaters or creates hip hop video, like that is someone deeply invested in it. It's not making media for other people, it's making media for themselves. And I find that like that moment that you're describing is probably what I've been able to, got me to Chicago, right? These bands that would come through Switzerland totally illegally because the work permit was too expensive. So they would circumvent the Europe, right? You go to Italy, maybe the Eastern blocs, Slovenia, Poland, Germany, France, I don't know. But you would not go to the countries that had expensive work permits. And so the only way to do it financially was to do basement, couch surf, and move in that network, like the zine network kind of was out there. And so the music that I found was being organized, and I think it's, for me, very interesting that the art part, like apartment galleries for art, very much are in the same kind of ecology, finding its own audience, supporting its own audience, and also kind of finding their own language in it. And I'm so grateful for that in this city specifically. So when I answer this, what about the Chicago of it all? It's like, it ain't waiting for anybody. The people doing it. And I thought about why is this so? And I always refer to Chicago as a land witch, an island, and around is land or more land. And there's, we have a very specific climate and a specific diet, and you can't, but around us, just bear with me. I talk like a cloud, so it can be a little bit frustrating. But when you're not a port city, where you're always can like wheel and deal with influx of content or goods, when you're in the middle of the continent and there is no port coming to you, you got to be the provider, the grower, and the supplier, and the performer. You got to do it all. That mentality, I find like really comes into play when it is around not only, this married space of self-expression, finding the structure, and then not waiting. So I feel like this emergency is really baked into our city. You layer political stuff onto it, then it's gonna always have this beautiful energy, and I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah, I mean, one last thing I would add is like, to me, Chicago was just a working city, right? And like that was true in the scene as well. Like you were so much kind of judged on the work you were doing, right? Like and you just did the work. Like I always think about the thing that blew my mind was like Bettina Richards, who ran Thrill Jockey Records, and Nan Warshaw, who ran Bloodshot Records. Two really big. Thrill Jockey was kind of like a post-rock indie label, and Bloodshot was a alt-punk or alt-country indie label. Both huge, both from Chicago, both run by women, which is not the norm for independent record labels. They both started at the same time, and they both hit their 10-year anniversary at the same time. And I remember they had never met, right? And I remember at one point I was talking to Bettina, and I was like, how have you never met Nan? She was like, well, I've just been working. Like, I've been working for 10, not hanging out, I'm just working. And it's like, that's Chicago to me in a nutshell, is like you can have this incredible, these legendary labels, and the people are just like, yeah, what do you mean? I'm just putting records out. Like, that's what I'm doing. Okay. I think we should skip the next set of slides because we're like way further over. We should
I'm
jump
just gonna
to
go through them real quick. Okay.
I think, we just go right in because,
we're going to get into my photography. So I was really lucky. I want to say when I was 16, 17, my family pitched in and bought me my first 35 millimeter camera for Christmas. And I had already expressed an interest. Like I was right exiting out of high school soon, and it was one of the best gifts they ever gave me. And I began photographing people around me. And this is my friends and I hanging out in front of our house on 24th Street off of Western. And my sister's there, she's here, and just other people. So I just started photographing friends. That was it. I was like, I'm just going to take pictures of people around me. And then there came a point when, because I was going to the early Metro shows and Cubby Bear, the Igloo, all these places. And a lot of these shows, I was like, I will never take a camera to a show because they were just very sometimes aggressive scenes. And I'm like, I don't want to destroy my camera because if my camera's gone, it's over, you know? And there came a point when I started to actually take cameras to shows. So these are some, the Fugazi show when they played at Club Dreamers in Wicker Park before it was totally gentrified. And then, Neurosis, this was, I want to say, across the street from the Cubby Bear. What was that place?
What was?
Wrigley Side, yes, thank
right.
you,
Oh my
everyone.
God.
And
yeah.
then Operation Ivy, that was actually in Palatine, Illinois at Dirty Nelly's. I started to just photographing my bandmates, and I still do it. If I'm on a tour, I have a camera. So I had already, I went to Columbia College, I studied photography, Mary Ellen Mark's work, Robert Frank's The Americans was a huge impact on me. I love Nan Golden's work because it was so crude and so raw. Even like the real kind of creative, wild side of like Joel Peter Wiccan or people like that. So I was just a sponge absorbing all these photographers and their work. And, I don't know, it just moved me and I wanted to, what is it? All those photos aren't there. What happened? Okay,
Censored.
so let me reset it, see if it comes back. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, and then I was photographing also what was happening in my neighborhood. Like, Los Crudos were from Pilsen. We were from the south side of Chicago. So I came from Uruguay. My family left Uruguay as the dictatorship was unrolling there. My mom, a massive influence. I went to marches. We got involved. We weren't involved with we were the community. So it's like I wanted to say that because we weren't coming in from somewhere else. The kids from these neighborhoods, we grew up there. This was our lives. So when I was a part of these marches, like my bandmates, my friends, and I just was taking photos. So I had punk noise happening, political noise happening, and just life noise, right? So I was capturing some of that. And wonderful street theater group during, I want to say, one of the Fiesta de Soles or something off to the side. Then, the Underdog Records people organized a show in the Daily Plaza. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
So this is great. I love this photo. These girls were from Milwaukee. They drove out. They heard, Crudos and bands are playing outside. This is a show. There's a video where we wore suits and briefcases. This is it. But I remember Cammie, this tabling, doing I really was always drawn to the sort of political aspect of punk as well, the activist aspect of it. Okay, so these are photos. This was in Mexico when we went on a tour. We would do a lot of crazy touring. They weren't small tours. They were like 3 months. We're going to go and spend a month in Mexico, And I was just always with the camera. And people were like, oh, this guy with this camera, But now everyone's like, I'm so glad you did that, Because it's so much gets lost to time. And Jose, who's here as well. This is an early photo from early Crudos days. Even when I was just sitting somewhere bored, I'm like, I have to make something happen. So I did the self-portrait through a glass door. And, I didn't know what was going to happen. This is all shot, and this is in film. And when I got home to see it, I was like, I actually really love this photo. It's really nice. And this is a great photo for me. This is when we had our apartment. I found this apartment in Pilsen. It was 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms for $390 a month. That's so over. It's so over. Never happening again. But at the time, this was our life, and this was the Crudos house on 19th and Carpenter. We practiced in the basement of a cultural arts space called Calles y Sueños. I really love this because that's the Crudos mail pile. So it was like mail and record covers, and I would have to answer letters, and it became a corner of the apartment because it was just really a lot and overwhelming. And and this is a band that came from Belgium, hiatus? Yeah, Belgium. So they were from Belgium, and this became what was happening. We had bands coming from all over the planet who were coming to our neighborhood and just like coming to Pilsen. And it was really, the band was bringing all this sort of energy and people through, and I don't know, it was great. And the portraiture is always a huge thing for me. I love taking portraits of people. And there's something about this one here on this side. This kid sang for this punk band. He had this really sort of hard edge to him, and he's like, I want you to come to my house, my family's house. I'm like, okay, great, And we're there hanging out. I go, I want to do a portrait of you. And he just says like, yes. And he threw his arms up, and I was like, okay. I was like, I love it. Yeah, it's great, And yeah, I love portraits. So taking portraits of people, early Crudos members. This was another one. This young man was, I don't know, somewhere in Europe. We were on a 3-month tour of Europe in the middle of winter in a van with no heat. It was horrible. I remember we were in Poland and just kicking off my boots and sitting on my feet and rocking back and forth because it was so cold. But he showed up somewhere, I don't remember what country, and he says, hey, I need a ride. And we're like, okay. So we gave him a ride to France. And it was in France. Yeah, this photo was in France. And I remember we were outside of Paris, and he goes, Martin, I want you to meet my dad. He's this artist. And the family, they were from Colombia, I want to say. They were Colombian. And he goes, I want you to meet my dad. He has this beautiful house. It's not far from here. And we'll eat some food. And my dad's an artist. And we ended up going, and I was lucky enough to capture this really beautiful portrait of them. And I love it. All right. And then... Yeah, I get these ideas sometimes, and I convinced a friend to, I was like, I don't want to see your face. I don't want to see your face, but I have this idea, and it became sort of an early idea to what later became a Limpris record cover. So, and a detail, of course. I love looking at people and getting details. Some of these are, a little bit later. Japan, gauze, and just, portraits and band stuff. I love the energy. There's no better energy than a punk show. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's wonderful. And I think the next slide is what I've been doing lately, aside from just the band stuff. I did a documentary in 1998. It was part of my thesis project. And I basically decided to document the scene that we had created. And I said, you know what, do it, because no one's going to do it, or they're going to do it really it's going to be wrong. So I decided to do a 30-minute documentary, and I went on several tours. I had gotten a video camera and started interviewing people, and I put together Más allá de los gritos, Beyond the Screams. And then I do a zine once in a while called Susto. There's a binder in the back. You can flip through, pull them out, look at them. They're huge silk-screened posters, because I started getting really into screen printing at some point. And I have a current band called Canal Real. That artist, Gerardo Villarreal, is here. He did those portraits of us. So I do music. And then my current photography work, here's more Sustos. You get the idea of the scale of these, the really colorful envelopes and all that. And then my recent work is this stuff. So it's more personal work. I love doing the live band stuff. I love all that. But, I went to art school, so it's like there's this really, introspective, like I'm always thinking about things and I get ideas and then I try to execute them in some way. So this is the kind of work I've been putting a lot of energy into lately. That's it for me.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. I'm like stressing on time. We're going to go long. Sorry. Like, just chill with us. It's cold outside. So I have a little slide here. So of inspirations. So I was a kid that was into like art and politics before I got into punk, right? Like very political, very art, like 12-year-old for some reason. Jenny Holzer being a huge inspiration to me. The idea that she merged kind of words and said those could be art themselves was sort of mind-blowing to me as like a kid. I remember going to the MCA back when it was in their old building and they had a Jenny Holzer exhibition. It was just mind-blowing. Like that was one of those like pivot moments in your life where you're like, you walked in as one person, you walked out as another. Similarly, pivot moment for me was discovering the Washington, D.C. punk scene, which came via zines and records and bands that were coming through tour. And it just felt like this incredible utopia, right? Like just in a way that like the scene that now that I think about, like the scene that we had was probably very similar to the one there, but it came in this beautiful way. It also, these are a couple of records from Discord, had a very different aesthetic, which also really appealed to me as a kid that was getting into sort of aggressive music, but I wasn't as into the sort of traditional punk aesthetic, and kind of discovering that there was this whole scene that was into that. So that's just sort of a little bit of scene setting to set up the fact that I, like Martin, I was at art school, I was at the Art Institute here in Chicago, and this was in the early 90s, like 93, 94. And one of the things that was very hard about coming from sort of the punk scene and going into an art school was like everyone was sitting around waiting for something to happen. And I had come from this scene where everyone was just making things happen, right? And so it was there was a real kind of headbutting between what it felt like was happening in the school I was in and what was happening in the kind of culture that I was a part of. And one of the things that was happening at that time, so this was probably 93 is when this really kind of blew up. But so Nirvana had signed to a major label in 1992, right? And Green Day signed to a major label, and Dookie came out in 1994. So you're talking about this kind of couple of year window where suddenly what had been very underground, right, was suddenly not. And there was a lot of money and a lot of attention in the punk scene that hadn't been there at the time. And as I think rightfully so, the underground rebelled against that, right? But one of the things that was true, again, we're talking about 93, 94, so pre-internet, right? Fanzines, like we had said, were sort of the key way that you could get information out. And there were a couple of really big ones, Flipside being one, Maximum Rock and Roll being one. Maximum Rock and Roll being really the biggest one at the time. At least for me, Flipside was sort of like of the scene, but felt it was very LA. It didn't resonate in the same way for me, at least. But Maximum Rock and Roll was like, we're getting too many records, right? We don't like most of these records, like, and so they instituted a review policy, and which they had never done before, other than no major label records, and that policy was worded in about the worst possible way, which was just, we're only going to review punk records, right? Which was hard because everyone's sending Maximum Rock and Roll, a black and white newsprint fanzine in San Francisco, a record, thought they were sending them a punk record, right? And what that meant especially was a lot of folks, this was sort of early 90s in the Midwest, right? So it's sort of like the Midwestern emo scene was coming up, and that wasn't really getting the attention there. A lot of the bands from DC, there was very famously a band called Rain Like the Sound of Trains that didn't sound anything like a normal punk band, and like Maximum like kind of crucified them, right? Like, this isn't what punk should sound like. And so this was also pre-internet, but not pre-computer and pre-modems, right? So I was actually in sort of a discussion about all of this that was happening in an America Online message board, right? And so at the time, I was like, I asked the question that I think is kind of the fundamental question of punk, which is, why can't we just do this, right? Like this magazine isn't doing what we want. Why don't we start one, right? There are 8 million answers to the question of why should we, why can't we start one? But we didn't know those answers at that time. And so about 2.5 months from when that came out, the first issue of Punk Planet came out. That's actually the first issue up in the upper left-hand corner. This is the first 4 years of Punk Planet. It started coming out every other month, literally from the moment, the idea, 2.5 months later, issue 1. And then every 2 months from then on. You can see over this kind of spread of 4 years, it changes dramatically, right? Like we were borrowing the look and feel and template of Maximum Rock and Roll very early on, right? It was really big, and that's how we learned, right? None of us knew what we were doing. It was all volunteer. Those volunteers were actually coming from that same message board, right? So they were actually spread out all over the country, which meant we were literally mailing floppy disks to each other, right? Like absolute madness. Now that I think about it, it was email and phone calls, and you would mail floppy disks and load them in to make your computer. Every issue, I always talk about Punk Planet as being a very public learning process, right? First issue is terrible of Punk Planet. Like, it's just bad. The writing's bad. It looks bad. The whole thing is not great. But you would an issue would come out. The beauty of a periodical, right, is you've got to get it out, and then you've got to get the next one out. And so what we would do was and by we, a lot of the time it's me, but it was the other folks working as well, especially as the kind of years progressed, would just say, okay, well, what actually worked? Like, let's try to do that a little bit more. And what didn't work? Let's not do that again, right? And you just grow, and it grew from there. And I mean, it's kind of wild to see kind of this 4-year spread, because you go from this kind of black and white, they were really thin. Like, you can literally see on that first issue, you can see the inside of the cover through the cover, right? It was this very, very, very thin, very cheap, like that's writing going up vertically. To by the time, the 4th year, this is the art and design issue, was sort of a game-changing issue for us, where we said, you know what, like punk magazines, like Punk Planet at the time, were all music magazines. And we said, hey, you know what, let's not do an issue that has any music in it at all, except the record reviews at the end, right? Let's just talk about the art and design and photography and everything else that's happening in an issue. I've been doing a retrospective on my website, looking over the last every year of Punk Planet, and going to that one. So at that point, there was a guy named Josh Hooten who was helping to design and also write the magazine with me, and he wrote I think Josh did 80% of everything in that issue. And I'm like, dude, like what on earth? But it was great because it opened it up, right? As soon as that issue came out, we actually did 4, or was it 4 or 3? 2 of 4. So we did limited edition covers for that thing, which is also wild. That's House Industries, who now is like a big fancy font and design company. At the time, they were also fancy, but punk. But that sort of opened the floodgates for us, and we just started to say, hey, we can do anything, right? So this is years 5, 6, 7, and 8 here. That's Art and Design 2 with Jaime Hernandez on the cover. But, we began to expand very, very rapidly away from just writing about music, but to write, or even art and culture, but straight into politics as well. That issue, it's issue 30, the Murder of Iraq issue. This is pre-Gulf War, right? Or post-first Gulf War, second Gulf War, where there were just crippling sanctions on Iraq. And I had gotten connected with an organization here in Chicago called Voices in the Wilderness through a guy named Jeff Gunsel, who was the drummer for a band up in Minneapolis, and then met that Voices people and moved here. And we had a mutual friend, and we ended up connecting. to Jeff and other people would travel to Iraq to to break sanctions, and we ended up doing a cover story. And at the time, our main distributor was Mordam Records, who was a music, big, huge at the time, independent music distributor. And I remember Ruth Schwartz, who's an amazing, incredible woman who ran Mordam, got the issue and called me up and said, "You're committing suicide with this cover, right? Like, nobody wants to buy this." And we actually, that was the first issue we ever sold out of. And so again, it just sort of opened the floodgates. We wrote about police brutality. We, wrote about, we did a whole series of interviews with guys on death row, right? Just anything went at that point, including art and design. Years 9 through 12, the 50th issue, Chicago, that was sort of my own little personal project where it was like, 50 issues, how do we mark this? Let's write about the place that this magazine is from. That's John Langford did a portrait of Mayor Daley for the cover. And it was great. It was like, I'd be driving back from doing one interview or a photo set with somebody, and I passed by Hot Doug's, which back when it was on Roscoe, and was like, I don't know what this is, but I'm hungry. And I walked in and was like, this place is amazing. And then I just went back the next day and was like, can I interview you for this? And so Doug Sohn is in that issue. And it just kept growing from there. The final countdown, so this is obviously during the George W. Bush era. We commissioned, I think there were 12 posters that were in there with the whole idea was you could copy you could tear them out, blow them up, and put them out around town. And we had a bunch produced. There's Art and Design 3. We did 3 of those. But it was amazing, right? It was every single issue was, okay, well, that was great, but how can it be even better, right? Whether it was the design, whether it was the editorial. By the end of it, we had 4 folks that would come on our final production weekend, and we would just lay the whole thing out, and then we'd pin it up on these bulletin boards. You were there many times, Nadine. And you would just sit and critique them and be like, well, what if this looked like this? And you would just build from there, and then it ended. So year 13, unlucky 13. When we started Punk Planet, there were, I believe, 12 different distributors of small and independent press magazines in the U.S. And when we ended, there was one, and it went bankrupt, and they took us with them because this thing never made much money, right? It never. I think about the print cost was like a car. Every 2 months was buying a car, right? And yet we were able to make that, but we were not able to make much more. And so they went down. It took about a year. We kind of saw the writing on the wall. 80th issue, I decided I'm just going to start and just lay it out right there on the cover and just let people know. And the idea was, you know what? People can carry on, right? Things don't have to last forever. Things end. And Punk Planet did end. And that sucked. It really was awful. I don't talk about Punk Planet a lot because it's so awful that it was, yeah. Anyway, point being, it was great. It really, really was. And I've continued to do work. Never, another magazine would be very hard to do a magazine now. Obviously, as mentioned in the introduction, I wrote the @MayorEmanuel Twitter account in the lead up to the 2010 mayoral election. It turned into a book. I've done podcasting, the Sesu podcast with my friend Maureen Johnson, who's an author. Was supposed to be 8 episodes long for the final 8 weeks before the 2016 election. And now I think we're about to record our 360th episode. I've been doing a podcast with Akilah Hughes called Rebel Spirit, which is, I've been producing on that and doing a lot of the reporting on that. It's about her trying to change the racist mascot at her high school. It is easily the most punk rock thing I have done since Punk Planet. And then this thing is Joe Mino, who is an author here in Chicago who worked on Punk Planet with me for a very long time as well. Me and him just did a year-long collaborative art and storytelling project called Question Mark Ohio that I built 50 separate websites for to kind of tell the story of this town. All of this is still that same question that we asked at the start of Punk Planet, which is, why can't we do this, right? And let's not wait for somebody to give us money for it or to ask us for it. Like, let's just put this out. And that's still the kind of driving force of everything that I do. So I'm going to throw to Nadine.
So you guys must be exhausted.
No,
by
they're
all this
not. They're having a good
information.
time.
So I'm going to improvise. The title of tonight's night is Photography, Art, and Design with, Chicago Punk. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide through these. That shows my personal development getting here to Chicago. And I'm going to do it like this, and I did not plan it like this, just to have a moment of respite, to take it all in, and then also accelerate it to Q&A because we're here for you. So
Nadine, say something about it.
and I think it's great that you might not know what I do or who I am because this is the perfect space. So I am going to comment on the last two slides. All that kind of brought me here to Chicago, applying to this internship. And what I found here, I came to all of this more from an economic point, trying to find the means to center my life in a way that made sense. And it started with skateboarding, it started with music, it led me to art. And then I realized I cannot follow design. It will trap me even more in this suspect system. And the only way I would have a way to discover, to not wait, and to express and put out was to start a print shop. And I thought it was very powerful to see your labor go one and one into the expression out into the world. And because screen printing is like, you can be like a line cook, there's everything from like just getting it out to very high-end an art market. It's really this scalable model where you can really be in. And I don't think I would be here without the people that really were able to make it not just about a genre, but kind of, I wouldn't even say attitude, but an aptitude towards a certain appetite of how they wanted to spend their time of day. And I'm really grateful for that. And what I do now with my partner, Nick Butcher, who's here in the audience back there, I run Sonnenzimmer, and we have a very wonky business model. It's scalable. We kind of we weave in and out of structures. We work with very different entities. A lot of our business is artists, so they're very generous, but it's also really hard to ask for money from them. But on the one page, you see this poster called Golden Egg, and it's a retirement project for musicians. And I'm really glad to be able to show this poster because it was made this year with Experimental Sound Studio, who's heading up this initiative to try to create retirement resources for musicians. And this is like a good example of how so much of that core orientation in our city keeps showing up for each other. And it's very artist to artist led. And I do think I get to sit here with you guys and with you because it's this artist-led effort, not top-down culture, but carried through each other. So that brings me to
I think we jump
back to
all the way
you.
to the Q&A. I
Yeah.
think we go to Q&A at this point because we're just asking ourselves questions here, but you all have questions. There we are. Look at that with a phone number, but I think I need that.
Hi,
pad
I'm
or
sorry, we
whatever.
don't have time for a Q&A, but
Oh!
I know that I'm assuming that you all will be sticking around for a few minutes if people would like to come up to you.
We
Is
will
that-
definitely
is that
take
true?
your
Okay.
Q's and A's for
Awesome.
sure.
Thank you so much
Um,
to everyone for coming.
Awesome.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you so much to the artists.
We went long.